Hi, this is Mo from Smart Training 365. Today's video will help you know which exercises to select for your goal and build muscle efficiently and safely using our 16 biomechanical factors that determine exercise efficiency. Before we start, I'd like you to know that an exercise that complies with the 16 biomechanical factors is considered a Brick 20 exercise. An exercise that complies with 14 or 10 factors can be considered the second best, third best, and so on. The less factors an exercise complies with, the further from ideal we move. This can be your go-to video because it requires watching it a couple of times, so make sure you save it. Now let's get started. The ideal direction of anatomical motion is one that moves the target muscle's insertion directly toward the muscle's origin upon concentric contraction of that muscle. Then upon eccentric contraction of that muscle, the insertion of that muscle is moved directly away from that muscle's origin. This determines the ideal trajectory of the limb being operated by that target muscle. A muscle can participate in other motions along with other participating muscles, but in diminishing percentages. Performing the precise anatomical motion that a muscle is meant to produce is generally more productive than performing an anatomical motion that departs from that precise motion. A motion that is similar to the precise motion of that target muscle would naturally require more participation from other muscles and less from the target muscle. The ideal range of motion for an exercise targeting a particular target muscle is one that utilizes all or most of the muscle's motion capacity. This would cause complete or most complete muscle contraction, as well as complete muscle elongation. Performing an exercise with mostly full range of motion has been shown to be significantly more productive than performing an exercise with partial range of motion. This was proven true even when more weight is used during the partial range of motion and less weight with full range of motion. Let's talk about isometric exercises. Isometric contraction produces no skeletal motion and results in no muscle shortening nor elongation. Rather, the muscle is required to hold a particular joint or skeletal position against resistance. Isometric muscle contraction has been demonstrated to be significantly less productive than dynamic muscle contraction for the goal of strength development through a muscle's entire range of motion, and also for visible muscle hypertrophy. Reciprocal inhibition is a mechanism whereby the central nervous system reduces or completely inhibits the innervation of an antagonist muscle when the agonist muscle is activated. An example of this, the triceps innervation is inhibited when the biceps is loaded and engaged. This prevents the triceps from interfering with the activation of the biceps. Reciprocal inhibition allows the body to be coordinated to not interfere with itself when performing physical tasks. However, in some cases during some compound exercises, a muscle which we intend to target is forced to be the antagonist of another muscle, which we are also intending to target. When this happens, that muscle is forced to relax, despite your intentions. This results in compromised benefit and wasted effort. Specifically, this happens when one of the participating muscles crosses two joints and serves two functions, and you are performing a multi-joint exercise, one of which opposes the other. Examples of this are barbell squats, leg press, or any other exercises that combine simultaneous knee extension and hip extension. Glutes activation shuts off the hip flexors, one of which is part of the quadriceps, which is the rectus femoris. For this reason, the knee extensors, quadriceps, including the rectus femoris, would be activated more effectively without the simultaneous activation of the hip extensors, and the hip extension would be activated more effectively without the simultaneous activation of the quadriceps. Isolating each of these two joint functions would avoid the neurological interference caused by combining the two joint functions simultaneously. This does not mean that squats have no value. It simply means that muscle development of the quadriceps and the hip extensors achieved by way of squat is less than optimal as compared with isolation exercises. Squats and other compound leg movements do have proprioceptive value, which is useful in sport and activities that involve movements similar to squats. Muscles that are biarticular, they cross two joints instead of only one joint, are subject to having their length increased or decreased based on the position or the angle of their non-primary joint. For example, the biceps crosses the elbow joint and the shoulder joint. The primary joint is the elbow, because the primary function of the biceps is elbow flexion. Its non-primary joint is the shoulder, because the shoulder joint is moved primarily by the pecs and or deltoids. However, the length of the biceps is influenced by the position of the angle of the shoulder joint. If the shoulder joint is positioned such that the arm is extended posteriorly, the biceps is elongated, the insertion of the biceps is moved further away from its origin. If the shoulder joint is positioned such that the arm is held directly in front of you or up alongside your head, the biceps is shortened, the insertion is moved closer to its origin. This is known as active insufficiency. It's referred to as the active muscle because it's the muscle doing the work experiences compromised strength when it has insufficient length. Ideally, a biarticulate target muscle should have its non-primary joint positioned such that it allows the target muscle to have sufficient length, thereby allowing optimal strength potential during the exercise. In the previous factor, I explained that muscles that cross two joints are subject to having their length increased or decreased based on the angle of their non-primary joint. In that example, the issue was the overshortening of the muscle doing the work. However, a biarticular muscle can also be overstretched when it's passive muscle, positioned opposite the active agonist muscle. This is called passive insufficiency. It's referred to as passive because it's the muscle that is not actively working, and it is insufficient because the excessive stretching prevents the active muscle from being able to complete its range of motion with full force. One example of this occurs when hip flexion is performed with straight knee. Keeping the knee straight would maximally stretch the hamstrings. This typically prevents the hip from flexing as much as it could if the knee were bent. You can see how I'm compensating for this conflict of interest by rounding the spine. Doing so lessens the degree of hamstring stretch, although the remaining hamstring stretch would still limit the degree of hip flexion that is possible. Also, there appears to be a degree of inhibited innervation of the hip flexors caused by the CNS trying to prevent the overstretching of the hamstrings. The solution in this case is to simply bend the knee as you flex the hip. Adding resistance like ankle weights to compensate for the shorter level length of the leg is an option. There's a significant difference between using a barbell versus using dumbbells in terms of muscle loading. Independent loading is far more advantageous than using a single instrument. Independent limb loading produces greater coordination demand as compared with using a barbell or single instrument for both right side, left side limbs, and also requires distinctly different exercise mechanics. For example, a flat bench barbell press prohibits you from being able to pull the hands and arms medially toward the midline of the body. When using a barbell, your fixed hand position on the bar requires a more linear diagonal push, which engages the triceps more by way of friction force, although arguably not enough to qualify as a great triceps exercise, and engages the pectorals less. It also compromises the pectorals range of motion because you are unable to complete the final 30% of the pectorals range of motion. In addition, independent limb loading triggers cross-education, which causes an added strength and coordination benefit to cross over to the contralateral muscle by the separate loading and activation of the ipsilateral muscle. Typically, the percentage of cross benefit of the contralateral muscle ranges between 7 to 34% in the ipsilateral muscle benefit. Therefore, wherever it's practical to do so, using unilateral muscle loading is ideal. Bilateral exercise is the term typically used when referring to muscle activation using both limbs with a single instrument like a barbell. However, it's also often used when referring to independently loaded, simultaneous muscle activation, as explained in Principle 6. Separately loading each side is better than using a single instrument, even when both independently loaded sides are activated simultaneously. However, better still is activating only one side at a time as compared with activating both sides simultaneously. The reason for this is due to a trait known as bilateral deficit, which causes each side to be a little bit weaker when working bilaterally, compared when working unilaterally, one side at a time. Sometimes when attempting to target a particular muscle, another muscle that is engaged in assisting or maintaining posture, but it's not the target muscle, will fail first, causing the set to end before the target muscle has been effectively challenged. An example of this is the bent over barbell row. The erector spinae is loaded more than the latissimus or the middle trapezius and fatigues before the target muscles are maximally challenged. An ideal exercise is one that minimizes the excessive simultaneous participation of weaker non-targeted muscle because it limits the maximum engagement of the target muscle. Avoiding peripheral recruitment also decreases the risk of injuring the weaker non-target muscles. This is a common problem associated with compound exercises because they engage various muscles simultaneously and each to the degree dictated by the physics of the exercise, not per the prioritization of the person doing the exercise. The weaker muscle fails first despite it not being the target muscle. The human musculoskeletal system evolved over millennia to accommodate routinely necessary anatomical motions. An ideal exercise would mimic those natural motions, thereby allowing joints to move without strain, as they were meant to move. However, many traditional exercises do not mimic natural anatomical motions. A natural motion could be defined as one that our early ancestors needed to do routinely with a degree of force, or one which can be easily performed by the vast majority of people without joint discomfort. One example of a natural joint torque, joint distortion, is the excessive external rotation of the humerus as well as impingement of the supraspinatus tendon and the subacromial bursa that occurs during overhead pressing movements. An example of unnecessary spinal loading is heavy barbell squats. It's never beneficial to load the spine with very heavy downward compression. The spine can tolerate a fairly heavy amount of load, and it does benefit, example, improved bone density from some degree of load. But the spine receives plenty of weight-bearing stimulation from other resistance exercises like heavy vertical shrugs, for example. But very heavy and frequently downward compression of the spine drastically increases the risk of spinal injury. It's prudent to minimize it whenever is possible. An ideal exercise meant for a particular target muscle is one that does not cause the moment arm of the target muscle's primary lever to be reduced by a secondary lever. Another example of this sometimes occurs during supine dumbbell press performed for the pectorals. During a supine dumbbell press, the humerus is the primary lever because it's the limb onto which the pectorals are directly attached. However, the dumbbells are not held by the humerus. There is no hand at the end of the humerus with which a weight can be held. Rather, the weight is held by the hand at the distal end of the forearms. Therefore, the forearm becomes the secondary lever because it's attached to the primary lever, but it's not directly connected to the pectorals. For this reason, the forearm's position influences the load experienced by the pectorals. Tilting the forearm laterally has the effect of increasing the moment arm of the humerus, essentially lengthening it. This causes an increase in the magnification of the load on the pectorals. Tilting the forearm medially has the effect of reducing the moment arm of the humerus, essentially shortening it. This causes a reduction of magnification of the load on the pectorals. It is more efficient to use an exercise or to use exercise form that allows the target muscle's operating length to use its full effective length without moment arm reduction. This would optimize the loading of the target muscle. When loading a particular target muscle, the ideal direction of resistance should cause the limb operated by that muscle to encounter a point at which it is perpendicular to the direction of resistance, somewhere in that muscle's range of motion, preferably during the early phase. Another example of an inefficient muscle loading occurs during parallel bar dips when the intention is to load the tricep. The forearm is the operating limb of the triceps. Notice the angle of the forearm is approximately 10 degrees from vertical, neutral position. This results in a very short moment arm using lines that run parallel with the direction of resistance. Compare that with the supine dumbbell triceps extension. It is much more efficient in terms of loading the triceps with the greatest percentage of the load and the least wasted effort. This same physics principle is in play during all resistance exercises. The width of the moment arm determines how much resistance a muscle encounters as a percentage of the amount of weight being moved. An ideal exercise meant for a particular target muscle is one that does not cause the operating limb of the target muscle to encounter a neck or a base in the middle of that muscle's range of motion. In the dumbbell triceps kickback, you can see that the forearm reaches the base when the elbow is at 90-degree bend. This vertical forearm position results in the triceps experiencing zero resistance despite the triceps being at its strongest phase of the range of motion. When the elbow is extended, the forearm reaches the horizontal position, which delivers the most resistance to the triceps because the triceps operating lever is perpendicular to gravity. However, that is the point where the triceps has the least strength potential. Another thing to mention here is crossing over to the other side of the apex or base in the middle of an exercise range of motion results in additional problem. It causes a transference of the load to the antagonist muscle, the biceps in this case. This would result in the target muscle being neurologically disengaged due to reciprocal inhibition. Given that the objective of an exercise is to optimize stimulation of the target muscle, it is obviously counterproductive for that muscle to be neurologically deactivated in the middle of its range of motion. The ideal position for a target muscle during an exercise intended for that muscle is to position its origin directly opposite to the direction of resistance and also with the origin and insertion of that muscle. The side dumbbell raise is a good example. The trajectory of my arm here is from north to south as per the compass. The direction in which resistance or gravity is pulling my arm is from south to north. This is perfect given the intention of working the lateral deltoid. Notice also that the origin of my lateral deltoid is positioned directly south, opposite the direction of resistance. An ideal exercise intended to target a particular muscle is one that provides more resistance during the early part of that muscle's range of motion, known as early phase loading, and less resistance in the later part of that muscle's range of motion. Skeletal muscles are generally stronger, have more strength potential when they are elongated, and weaker when they are shortened. This is known as the natural strength curve of a muscle. A muscle tends to have more recoil when it's at a greater length because its actin filaments are more spread out. A muscle tends to lose strength potential when it contracts because its actin filaments slide over each other, essentially colliding, thereby compromising the muscle's ability to produce optimal contractile force. Therefore, it is most productive to utilize exercises that provide more resistance during the early phase of the range of motion and less resistance during the late phase of the range of motion. An ideal exercise intended to optimally improve muscular development is one that is stable. A resistance exercise that is performed while unstable on a wobbly foundation, for example, or on one leg on a Swiss ball or an uneven surface, compromises the ability of the person to produce maximum force with the participating muscles. Instability forces the person to use a lesser weight in order to prevent falling. It also compromises ideal exercise form, distracts from one's ability to concentrate on precise anatomical motion, increases the risk of injury, and often interrupts completion of the set because balance was lost. and stable exercises compromise optimal muscle development. An ideal resistance exercise allows a person to select and use a resistance level that is within the person's strength capacity and allows a reasonable number of repetitions to be performed using full range of motion. If only one level of resistance is available for that particular exercise and that amount of resistance is too light, meaning insufficient resistance to be productive, or too heavy, excessive resistance limiting the number of repetitions to a fewer reps, requiring maximum effort without sufficient warm-up and compromise in form, range of motion, the exercise is effectively disqualified as being optimally beneficial, even if the movement would be considered ideal when using the proper level of resistance. Bodyweight exercises typically do not allow a person to decrease the amount of resistance if one's body weight is excessive for that exercise. An ideal exercise would allow a person the option of selecting resistance levels that are within that person's capacity to perform repetition ranging from high to low, with reasonable resistance increases on successive sets, all with full range of motion. These were the 16 biomechanical factors that determine exercise efficiency. I hope you liked the video. I know there was a lot of information, but as I said, you might need to watch and rewatch this video. But if you want to start working out efficiently today, I recommend you get the Brick 20 program. You will get a much deeper understanding on how these principles are applied. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me. Thank you for watching the video. Take care.